The air in the great hall of the Silver Moon Pack was thick with the scent of pine, roasting meat, and contempt. Lysandra felt the weight of it pressing down on her, a physical force that made her shoulders ache. She stood alone in the center of the packed hall, the rough-spun wool of her tunic scratching at her skin. Hundreds of eyes, glowing faintly with lupine light in the dim torchlight, were fixed on her. They were not eyes of kin. They were the eyes of judges, of executioners of the soul. Tonight was the rejection ceremony, a night of reckoning. At the head of the hall, on a raised dais carved from ancient oak, sat her father, Alpha Garath. His silver-streaked hair was a crown of moonlight, his face a mask of stern duty. He looked at her, and she saw nothing of the man who had once bounced her on his knee. She saw only a ruler assessing a flaw in his domain. Lysandra of Silvermoon, his voice boomed, each word a hammer blow against the shield of her composure. She flinched. You have seen 18 winters. You have come of age, yet you have not shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Shifting was everything. It was identity, strength, belonging. To be wolfless was to be a ghost, a hollow shell in a world of vibrant primal life. I know, she thought, her throat tight as a knot. Do you think I have not prayed? Do you think I have not clawed at my own skin on the full moon, begging for the change that never comes? Her inner world was a silent scream. Outwardly, she was a statue of shame. You cannot join the hunt, her father continued, his voice devoid of all warmth. You cannot join the defense of our territory. You cannot bear true-born shifter pups for any warrior of this pack. Each declaration was a nail in her coffin. He was listing her failures, her utter lack of value, as if reading from a merchant's ledger. You are a dud, he proclaimed, the word sharp and ugly. It landed in the center of her chest and shattered what little hope remained. A drain on our resources, a weakness in our bloodline. He rose to his feet, his shadow stretching long and monstrous across the stone floor, nearly touching her feet. By the ancient laws of the Silver Moon Pack, I, Alpha Gareth, cast you out. Gasps echoed in the hall, but they were not of shock. They were of grim satisfaction. This was the cleansing they had craved, the removal of the defective part. You are no longer of Silver Moon, he declared, his gaze sweeping over his pack, not her. Your name is struck from our lineage. You will take nothing but the clothes on your back. You will walk from this hall and never return. He pointed a single damning finger toward the heavy wooden doors. Go. Walk into the deadwood. Your fate is your own, and it is no longer our concern. The deadwood. The words were a death sentence. It was a cursed, tangled expanse of forest that separated their lands from the brutal territory of the Shadowclaw pack. It was a place of rogues, starvation, and shadows that devoured the unwary. No one survived the deadwood alone, especially not a wolfless Omega. Tears burned behind her eyes, hot and acidic, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them that. Her silence, her stillness, was the only armor she had ever possessed. It was a thin, brittle shield, but it was hers. She held her father's gaze for a single heartbeat-long moment, searching for a flicker of regret, of love, of anything. There was nothing. Only the cold, hard finality of his judgment. With a dignity she did not feel, Lysandra turned her back on him. She turned her back on the only home she had ever known. The crowd parted for her, a sea of disgust receding from her path. She could feel their smirks, hear their whispered insults. Useless. Better off dead. Freak. Her feet felt like lead as she walked toward the doors. Each step was a severing. The bond to her family, her pack, her past, all of it unraveling with every footfall. She reached the great doors, and the guards swung them open, letting in a blast of cold night air that smelled of damp earth and decay. It smelled of her future. She did not look back. She stepped out into the darkness, and the doors of her world slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like the crack of a breaking bone. She was nothing. She was no one. And she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick roots and decaying leaves. 3 days. It had been 3 days since she was cast out, and each sunrise felt less like a blessing and more like a curse, illuminating her slow march toward death. Hunger was a dull, constant ache in her belly. Fear was a cold serpent coiled around her heart. Lysandra huddled at the base of a gnarled oak, its branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the bruised twilight sky. She had found a small trickle of water, but her last scavenged berries were a distant memory. The deadwood lived up to its name. It was a place leached of life, where even the air felt thin and grieving. A twig snapped behind her. Her head shot up, every nerve ending screaming. Her human senses were pathetic compared to a shifter's, but the scent that reached her was unmistakable. Wet fur, stale blood, and a rank, desperate malice. Rogues. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. From the deepening shadows, 3 pairs of eyes materialized, glowing with a sickly yellow light. They were lean, scarred wolves, their bodies twisted with madness and starvation. They were packless, lawless, and they saw her not as a person, but as meat. A low growl rumbled from the largest of the 3, its lips peeling back to reveal yellowed fangs. They began to circle her, their movements fluid and predatory. There was nowhere to run, no one to call for. This was it, the end her father had sentenced her to. A bitter, ironic thought surfaced through her terror. At least it will be quick. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable rush, the tearing of fang and claw. But it didn't come. Instead, a new sound cut through the air. It was not the snarl of a rogue. It was a roar, a sound of pure, absolute authority. It was a sound of such dominant power that the very trees seemed to tremble, and the ground vibrated beneath her worn-out boots. Her eyes flew open. The rogues had frozen, their hackles raised, whining in terror. They were no longer looking at her. They were looking past her, into the darkness from which the roar had come. Then they emerged. Figures of shadow and nightmare. They were massive, their wolf forms larger and darker than any she had ever seen in her own pack. Their pelts were the color of midnight and storm clouds. At their lead was a wolf so immense it seemed to blot out the sky, its fur the color of polished jet, its eyes burning like twin crimson coals. The Shadowclaw pack, the lead rogue, which had seemed so terrifying moments before, tucked its tail between its legs and groveled, exposing its throat in a desperate plea for mercy. The great black wolf did not grant it. With a speed that defied its size, it lunged. The attack was a blur of savage, brutal efficiency. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a wet gurgle, and it was over. The other 2 rogues scattered, yelping in panic, but they didn't get far. 2 more of the dark warriors intercepted them, their movements a symphony of deadly grace. Within seconds, silence fell once more. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of the victors and the frantic thumping of Lysandra's own heart. The giant black wolf stood over the body of its kill, then its head lifted. Those burning crimson eyes, terrifying and intelligent, locked onto hers. A strange stillness came over her. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but something else bloomed alongside it. Awe, recognition, a primal hum deep in her soul that she had never felt before. The massive wolf took a step toward her, and then another. As it moved, its form began to ripple and shift. Bones cracked and reformed, fur receded, and the shape of a man rose from the fading form of the beast. He was even more intimidating as a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in black leather armor that seemed to drink the light. His hair was as black as his wolf's pelt, and his eyes, they were the same burning crimson. A jagged scar cut down from his left temple, narrowly missing his eye. This was a face carved from granite and violence. This was Draven, the Shadow King, the Alpha of Alphas, whose name was a curse whispered by children in her old pack. He stopped a few feet from her, his presence an overwhelming wave of power and command. His gaze raked over her, taking in her torn tunic, her thin frame, her wolfless human vulnerability. She expected him to sneer. She expected him to finish the job the rogues had started. Instead, a frown creased his brow. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep within the earth. "You are packless," he stated. It was not a question. Lysandra could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He saw the faint markings of the silver moon pack on, the tattered collar of her tunic, faded but still visible. "Silver Moon territory ends at the river. You are trespassing." His warriors had shifted back to their human forms now, gathering behind him. They were a gallery of scarred, brutal faces, and their expressions were clear. They saw her as prey. "Kill her, Alpha," one of them growled. "She's a stray." Worthless. Draven didn't even glance at the man who spoke. His smoldering eyes remained locked on Lysandra. He took another step closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He tilted his head, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. It wasn't pity. It was curiosity. Assessment. What was he seeing? A pathetic, cast-out girl. A meal for crows. Then, he did the last thing she could have ever imagined. He unclasped the heavy, fur-lined cloak from his own shoulders. It was a magnificent thing of black wolf fur, radiating warmth and the scent of snow and iron. He swept it around her, enveloping her small frame in its impossible weight and heat. The scent of him was overwhelming, a dizzying mix of pine, winter air, and pure, undiluted power. It did not smell like a threat. It smelled like safety, like home. His knuckles brushed the side of her neck as he secured the clasp, and a jolt of lightning shot through her entire body. Her inner self, the spirit she never knew she had, uncoiled and purred in response. His eyes widened fractionally, feeling the spark too. "She is not worthless," he declared, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced all dissent. He looked at his men, his expression hardening back into a mask of command. "She is mine." The onyx spire was not a castle. It was a wound in the sky. A fortress of jagged black rock that clawed at the clouds, surrounded by a perpetual mist. It was as cold and unforgiving as its master. Lysandra was led through its massive gates, swallowed by its stone throat. The Shadowclaw warriors who escorted her treated her like a piece of baggage, their contempt a palpable force. They shoved her through corridors that felt like tunnels carved from ice, their walls bare of tapestries or any sign of warmth. The air tasted of cold stone and spilled blood. This was a place built for war, not for living. Every member of the pack she saw bore scars. Their eyes were hard, their movements economical and dangerous. They looked at her, wrapped in their alpha's cloak, with a mixture of confusion and raw hostility. Why would their king claim this thing, this weak, scentless, wolfless creature? She was a stray dog brought into a den of tigers. Her heart, which had been beating with a strange, hopeful rhythm under the protection of his cloak, now sank back into the familiar pit of her stomach. This was a mistake. He had made a mistake. Sooner or later, he would realize it and cast her aside just as her father had. The thought was a shard of ice in her veins. She was taken to the kitchens. The head cook, a burly woman with a face like a clenched fist and a scar that bisected her lip, sneered at her. "So this is the Alpha's new pet?" The woman, Morless, grunted. She snatched the magnificent cloak from Lysandra's shoulders. "You won't be needing this down here." The sudden loss of its weight and warmth was like being plunged into a frozen lake. The scent of him vanished, replaced by the smell of grease and boiling cabbage. The brief, impossible feeling of safety was gone. "She's to be put to work," the guard who had brought her said. "Alpha's orders." Morless's sneer widened. "Oh, I'll find work for her." She shoved a bucket and a coarse brush into Lysandra's hands. "The great hall floor is filthy. Get to it. And no slacking. We don't tolerate weakness here." Lysandra didn't respond. She had made a vow to herself in the forest, a silent, desperate promise. After her father's words had flayed her soul, she had sworn she would never speak again. Words were weapons, and she had been disarmed her entire life. Silence was her shield. Silence could not be twisted, could not be used to mock her. It was the only piece of herself she had left to control. She took the bucket and went to the great hall. It was vaster and more brutal than the one she'd left behind. A massive, cold-blackened fireplace dominated one wall, and long, scarred trestle tables filled the space. Banners bearing the sigil of a snarling black wolf hung from the rafters, looking down like silent judges. She knelt on the cold flagstones and began to scrub. The work was brutal, backbreaking. Her muscles screamed, her hands were raw within the first hour. The other servants, a collection of omegas and human thralls, ignored her or shot her venomous looks. She was an outsider, and worse, an outsider who had momentarily held the Alpha's favor. That made her a target. Days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of grueling labor and fitful, terrified sleep on a thin straw pallet in a communal servants' dormitory. She kept her head down. She kept her silence. She made herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. She did not see the Alpha King again. The hope that had flickered to life in the forest died a slow, cold death. It had been a whim, a moment of strange pity, perhaps. He had forgotten her already. She was just another piece of property, relegated to the lowest rungs of his fortress, just as she had been in her old pack. Nothing had changed, only the name of her cage. She scrubbed and swept and hauled, her body aching, her spirit shrinking. She built her walls higher, mortaring them with her silence. She retreated into the quiet world of her own mind, a barren but safe landscape where no one could hurt her. She was invisible. She was safe. And she was more alone than ever. The great hall was empty, save for her. It was late, the rest of the pack either in their beds or out on patrol. The only light came from the embers glowing in the massive hearth, casting long, dancing shadows that made the hall feel like the belly of some great beast. Lysandra was on her hands and knees, scrubbing a patch of floor where a warrior had spilled a mug of dark ale. The coarse bristles of the brush scraped against the stone, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. Her back was a knot of fire, her hands red and raw. A pair of black leather boots appeared in her field of vision. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She didn't need to look up. She knew who they belonged to. The scent of pine and cold iron preceded him, a scent her soul recognized with a painful lurch. Alpha Draven. He stood over her, a mountain of shadow and power. She remained kneeling, her eyes fixed on the floor, praying he would move on, that he wouldn't see her, even though she was the only living thing in the room. You, he said. His voice was that same low rumble, but it held a different quality now. Not command. Something else. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Look at me. It was an order, an alpha's command. It resonated deep in her bones, a compulsion she was physically incapable of denying. Slowly, reluctantly, she lifted her head. His crimson eyes burned down at her. He was not wearing his armor, but a simple black tunic that did little to hide the raw power of his frame. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. I did not bring you here for this, he said, gesturing to the bucket and brush. Then what did you bring me here for? The question screamed in her mind, but her lips remained sealed. He crouched down, bringing himself to her level. The sudden proximity was overwhelming. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way the scar tissue pulled at his skin. He was close enough to touch. The urge to do so was a terrifying, magnetic pull. Why do you not speak? He asked, his voice softer now, laced with a genuine curiosity that unnerved her more than his anger would have. She flinched and looked away, staring at the hearth. He followed her gaze. They told me you have not uttered a word since you arrived. He paused. Were you born mute? She gave the slightest shake of her head. Number. His eyes narrowed, studying her face with an intensity that felt like it was peeling back the layers of her soul. You choose this silence. It was a statement of fact. He was more perceptive than anyone she had ever known. He reached out and she flinched back, expecting a blow. But his hand was surprisingly gentle. He didn't touch her skin. He simply picked up one of her hands, turning it over to look at her palm. It was raw, blistered, the skin broken in places. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a dangerous sound. It wasn't directed at her. It was for the state of her hands, for the task she'd been forced to perform. This is not the work of a Luna, he murmured, almost to himself. The word hit her like a physical blow. Luna. It was an impossible, ridiculous notion. She was a defect, a wolfless omega. The idea was so absurd, it was cruel. He saw the flash of pain and disbelief in her eyes before she could hide it. He let go of her hand and stood, his expression once again unreadable. Leave this, he commanded, his voice regaining its sharp edge of authority. Come. He turned and walked toward a smaller door near the hearth, not looking back to see if she followed. He didn't need to. Her feet moved of their own accord, drawn by the invisible tether of his command and her own treacherous curiosity. He led her not to his chambers, but to a small private study. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, and comfortable-looking chairs were arranged before it. Bookshelves lined the walls, a surprising sight in this brutal fortress. It was the first truly warm, truly personal space she had seen. He gestured to one of the chairs. Hesitantly, she sat on the very edge of it. He remained standing, leaning against the mantelpiece, his eyes never leaving her. My beta, Corvain, believes you are a spy, he said conversationally, though the words were a cold shock. Sent from the Silver Moon Pack to weaken me? Lysandra's eyes widened in alarm. He says your silence is a trick, that your weakness is a disguise. Draven's lips twisted in a humorless smile. He advises me to have you tortured for information and then executed. Terror seized her. This was it. The kindness was a test, and she had failed. But then he shook his head, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. But I do not believe him. He pushed off the mantle and walked to a side table, pouring 2 goblets of water. He handed one to her. Their fingers brushed. The jolt was so strong this time that she gasped, a tiny, involuntary sound. His eyes flared with a dark, possessive light. "My wolf knows you," he said, his voice a low, intimate whisper that slid under her defenses. "It has known you since the moment I saw you in the woods. It does not see a spy. It does not see weakness." He leaned closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch so gentle, so full of unexpected tenderness that it broke something inside her. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. "It sees its mate," he finished, his voice raw with a longing that mirrored the one aching in her own chest. And in that moment, in the warmth of the firelight, she saw past the Shadow King, past the brutal Alpha. She saw a man who was just as lost, just as lonely as she was. The private study became their sanctuary. Every night, after her work was done and the fortress had settled into a restless slumber, one of Draven's personal guards would appear. He would nod at her curtly, his face a mixture of confusion and begrudging respect, and escort her to the Alpha's study. The first few nights she had been rigid with fear and uncertainty, but Draven never pushed. He never demanded she speak. He simply sat with her by the fire, sometimes in complete silence, the crackling of the flames the only sound between them. Slowly, her terror began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative comfort. He would talk. He told her of his pack, of the harsh laws that govern them, born from generations of war and hardship. He spoke of the curse that haunted his bloodline, a coldness that settled deep in the bones, making it hard to feel, hard to connect. A curse that made his wolf a restless, raging beast within him. "It is a constant battle," he confessed one night, staring into the fire, his crimson eyes reflecting the flames. "To control it, to keep the ice from freezing me completely." He looked at her then, his gaze intense. "But when you are near, the ice melts. The beast is calm." Her heart ached for him. She, who had always been seen as broken, was somehow a balm to his own brokenness. It was a dizzying, terrifying thought. The intimacy between them grew in the quiet spaces, a shared look across the flames, the way he would hand her a goblet, his fingers deliberately brushing hers. One evening, finding her shivering despite the fire, he rose and draped a soft fur blanket over her shoulders, his hands lingering there for a moment longer than necessary. The touch was electric, a silent conversation that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Her inner self, the wolf that wasn't, yearned for him with a fierceness that frightened her. It recognized him. Mate, king, ours. Her rational mind, however, was a storm of fear. She was nothing, a wolfless omega. How could she ever stand beside a king? The pack would never accept her. They would see her as a fatal flaw in their alpha, a weakness to be exploited. Her presence did not go unnoticed. Whispers followed her through the corridors like snakes in the grass. The other servants now treated her with a fearful deference that was almost worse than their earlier contempt. The most venomous glares came from Corvain, Draven's beta. Corvain was everything the Shadowclaw pack valued. He was huge, scarred, and brutally efficient. His loyalty to Draven had always been absolute, but it was a loyalty to the idea of Draven, the unfeeling, invincible Shadow King. He saw Lysandra as a disease. He cornered her one afternoon in a deserted hallway. His sheer size was intimidating, blocking out the light. "I don't know what game you are playing, little stray," he snarled, his voice a low threat. "But it ends now." Lysandra stood her ground, her chin lifted, her silence her only weapon. "You have him bewitched," Corvain continued, taking a menacing step closer. "He speaks of calm and peace. These are the words of weak men. The Shadowclaw are not weak. Our alpha is not weak." He reached out, grabbing her arm in a painfully tight grip. "Whatever spell you have cast, I will break it, and I will break you. He will thank me for it when his mind is clear again." "Corvain." The voice was like the crack of a glacier, cold, sharp, and deadly. Draven stood at the end of the hall, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes not crimson flames, but chips of ruby ice. He had moved with no sound at all. Corvain immediately dropped her arm, spinning around. "Alpha! You were just... What?" Draven's voice was dangerously soft as he walked toward them, each step deliberate and menacing. "Threatening the woman I have claimed? She is a danger to you, to the pack." Corvain protested, a note of desperation in his voice. "She is making you soft." Draven stopped directly in front of his beta, looking down at him despite their similar height. The sheer force of his alpha presence was suffocating. "My strength and my softness are for me to define, not you." He glanced at Lysandra, his gaze momentarily losing its icy edge. "Are you harmed?" She shook her head, rubbing her arm where Corvain's fingers had dug in. Draven's eyes narrowed, and he turned his lethal attention back to his second-in-command. "You will not touch her again. You will not speak to her again. You will not look at her again. If you so much as breathe in her direction in a way I find displeasing, I will strip you of your rank and your skin. Do you understand me, Beta?" Corvain's face was pale. He bowed his head in submission. "Yes, Alpha." "Get out of my sight," Draven commanded. Corvain scurried. Away, but not before casting one last look at Lysandra. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a promise of future retribution. The air still crackled with tension. Draven turned to her, the ice in his eyes melting back into fire. He gently took her arm, his thumb tracing the red marks left by Corvain's grip. A low growl vibrated in his chest. "He will not harm you," he vowed, his voice a raw whisper. "I will never let anyone harm you again." In that moment, she believed him. And that terrified her more than anything, because believing him meant hoping, and hope was the most dangerous thing of all. The moon was a perfect silver coin hanging in an ink-black sky. It bathed the onyx spire in a ghostly light, softening its harsh edges. Draven did not lead her to the study tonight. Instead, he led her up a winding set of stairs she had never seen before, to a door that opened onto the battlements. The air was crisp and cold, but a small, sheltered alcove had been prepared. Furs were laid out on a stone bench, and a single brazier of glowing coals pushed back the chill. Below them, the vast, dark expanse of the Shadowclaw territory stretched out to the horizon. It was beautiful, in a wild and untamed way. "This is my favorite place," Draven said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the vastness of the night. "Up here, the noise of the fortress fades away. There is only the sky." Lysandra sat on the furs, pulling them around her. He stood beside her, leaning against the cold stone of the parapet, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. For a long time, they were silent. It was a comfortable silence now, a shared space rather than an empty one. She watched his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the moonlight caught in his dark hair. The ache in her chest, the constant yearning was a familiar companion. He turned to face her, his crimson eyes seeming to glow with a soft inner light. "Lysandra," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips was a caress. It was the first time he had used it. He sat down beside her on the furs, close enough that their legs were touching. The contact sent a tremor through her. "I have lived my entire life in a fortress of ice," he began, his voice low and earnest. "A prisoner of my own bloodline, my own power. I have felt echoes of emotion, rage, duty, possession, but they were cold things, distant." He looked down at his own hands, large and scarred, hands that had taken countless lives. "I accepted it. It was my fate to be the Shadow King, a ruler of winter and fear. I believed I was incapable of anything more." He lifted his gaze to hers, and the vulnerability she saw there stole her breath. "And then, I found you. A flicker of warmth in a world of frost." He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them for a moment before he gently cupped her jaw. His touch was reverent. "With you, Lysandra, I am not just a king. I am a man. The ice in my veins melts. I can feel." His thumb stroked her cheekbone. "I feel a protectiveness so fierce it consumes me. I feel a peace that I have never known. And I feel—" He hesitated, the word seeming foreign on his tongue. "A love so profound it frightens me." Her heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the impossible sight of this powerful, feared king laying his soul bare before her. "The bond between us is real," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I have denied it. I have fought it. I believed I was unworthy of it, that my curse would taint and destroy anything so pure. But I cannot fight it any longer." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm against her lips. "You are my mate," he declared, the words a sacred vow in the moonlight. "My other half, the missing piece of my soul." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own blazing with hope and raw need. "Be my Luna," he pleaded, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he had shown to no one else. "Stand by my side. Rule with me. Break your silence and speak to me. Say you will accept me. Say you will be mine." It was everything she had secretly, impossibly dreamed of. It was the validation she had craved her entire life. He was offering her not just a title, but his heart, his soul. And she knew, with a certainty that was like a physical agony, that she had to destroy it all. The words echoed in the moonlit air, a perfect, beautiful proposal that was also a death sentence. "Be my Luna. Say you will be mine." Every fiber of her being screamed yes. The silent spirit within her howled with joy and acceptance. Mate. King. Yes. But her mind, her cruel, rational mind, saw the truth. She saw herself standing beside him in the great hall, a wolfless Luna. She saw the sneers of his warriors, the disbelief, the contempt. She heard the whispers of how their mighty alpha had been weakened by a broken stray. She saw Corvain, his face triumphant, as the pack's faith in their leader began to crumble. A king's strength was in his pack's perception of him. She would be his undoing, a flaw in his armor, a crack in his foundation. They would see her as a curse, not a blessing, and they would be right. How could she, who had nothing, accept everything from him? It would be the ultimate act of selfishness. To save herself from loneliness, she would doom him to ruin. Love, she realized with a sickening clarity, was not about taking, it was about protecting. And the only way to protect him was to leave him. His eyes were searching hers, filled with a desperate, hopeful fire. He was waiting for her answer, for a single word, a nod, anything. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she pulled back from his touch. The loss of his warmth was immediate and absolute, like a door slamming shut on the only warmth in the world. She looked at him, her heart shattering into a million tiny, icy shards. She poured all of her self-loathing, all of her certainty of her own worthlessness, into her eyes. She let him see the broken thing she truly was. Then she shook her head. A slow, deliberate, final gesture. Number. The hope in his eyes died. It was not a flicker, but an instant extinguishing, as if she had thrown a bucket of ice water on his soul. The fire was gone, replaced by a chilling, fathomless hurt. Confusion warred with agony on his face. No, he whispered, the word a broken thing. He looked utterly lost. But the bond. I feel it. I know you feel it too. She had to make him believe the lie. She had to make him hate her, so he would let her go, so he would be safe from her. She pushed his hand away, a gesture of sharp, cold rejection. She stood up, wrapping her own arms around herself, creating a barrier between them. She looked away from him, out at the dark, empty landscape, making her expression as cold and indifferent as she could. The silence stretched, thick and painful. She could feel his stare on her, feel him trying to understand the incomprehensible. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer the warm, vulnerable tone of the man who had confessed his love. It was the voice of the Shadow King. It was flat, dead, and colder than the stone beneath their feet. I see. 2 words. They held the weight of a world of pain, of a heart freezing over once more. I was mistaken, he said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. The ice was back, thicker and more impenetrable than ever before. He had retreated behind his curse, using it as a shield against the pain she had just inflicted. He stood, his movements stiff and formal. He was no longer a man confessing his love. He was a king who had made a grave error in judgment. Forgive the presumption, he said, the words dripping with a bitter, formal courtesy that was worse than any shout. It will not happen again. He turned his back on her, a gesture of finality that mirrored the one she had made to her father. But this was infinitely more painful. This was a dismissal from paradise. The guard will escort you back to the kitchens, he said, not looking at her. Your services in my study are no longer required. He strode away without another word, his dark form disappearing down the stairwell, leaving her alone in the cold moonlight with the ruins of her own heart. The tears she had held back for so long finally came, silent and scalding, tracing paths of grief down her frozen cheeks. She had saved him, and she had destroyed them both. The fortress became her prison again, but this time it was worse. Before, there had been a fragile thread of hope connecting her to the Alpha. Now, there was nothing. The silence in the study had been a warm, shared space. The silence of the kitchens was a cold, empty void. Draven was a ghost. She never saw him, but his presence was everywhere. The fortress seemed to have absorbed his renewed coldness. The guards were harsher, the training sessions in the yard more brutal. The air itself felt brittle with unspoken pain and tension. Draven had withdrawn not just from her, but from his entire world, retreating deep into the icy shell of his curse. Lysandra scrubbed floors that were already clean. She peeled vegetables, until her fingers were numb. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the unending ache in her soul. She had done the right thing. She repeated it to herself like a mantra, a prayer to a God she no longer believed in. I did the right thing. But at night, on her thin straw pallet, the lie would crumble. She would feel the phantom touch of his hand on her cheek, hear the echo of his voice pleading, "Be my Luna," and she would curl into a tight ball, choking on silent sobs. Corvain watched her. His hatred had not abated with her fall from grace. It had sharpened. He saw Dreven's withdrawal, his descent back into cold, ruthless command, not as a return to form, but as a symptom of a deeper wound. He saw Lysandra as the source of that wound, a poison that still lingered in the Alpha's system, and Corvain was determined to be the cure. He saw his opportunity. With Draven lost in his own Arctic grief, the pack's leadership was fractured. Corvain, as Beta, began to exert more influence, his voice carrying more weight. He whispered in the ears of the other warriors, planting seeds of doubt. "The Alpha is not himself," he would say, his voice laced with false concern. "That wolfless stray did something to him, a witch's enchantment. It has weakened his spirit even if he cast her out." He needed proof. He needed a way to remove her permanently and solidify his own position as the true guardian of the pack's strength. He acquired a vial of frost thorn elixir from a shifty alchemist in the thrall markets. It was a rare, insidious poison. It did not kill, not directly. It mimicked and amplified the symptoms of Draven's own blood curse, deepening the cold, clouding the mind with paranoia, and slowly, inexorably, freezing the heart until nothing remained but ice. He slipped it into Draven's nightly carafe of wine, a task made easy by the Alpha's self-imposed isolation. The effect was subtle at first, then terrifyingly swift. Draven's already distant demeanor became glacial, his orders became irrational, his temper explosive and cold. He sentenced a warrior to a week in the ice cells for a minor infraction. He canceled patrols along a vital border. The pack was on edge, confused and frightened by their Alpha's erratic behavior. This was the moment Corvain had been waiting for. Under the guise of searching for the source of the Alpha's malady, he led a contingent of his most loyal guards to the servants' quarters. They tore the place apart, a whirlwind of calculated violence. They found Lysandra huddled by her pathetic pallet. "There," Corvain declared, his voice ringing with false triumph. He reached into the straw of her bedding and pulled out a small, empty vial, identical to the one he had used, which he had planted there himself moments before. Witchcraft. I knew it. Lysandra stared at the vial, her mind reeling in confusion and horror. She had never seen it before in her life. "This is Frost Thorn," Corvain announced to the assembled guards and servants, his voice booming. "A poison that mimics the Alpha's curse, driving him to madness. She has been poisoning our king, trying to destroy him from within." The accusations rained down on her. Witch, spy, assassin. Lysandra looked around at the faces of her accusers, at the fear and hatred in their eyes. She opened her mouth to deny it, to protest, but her vow of silence held her fast. And even if she could speak, who would believe her? A wolfless stray against the word of the pack's Beta. Rough hands seized her arms, hauling her to her feet. "By order of Beta Corvain, acting to protect the pack," he snarled, his face inches from hers, his eyes alight with victory. "You are under arrest for treason and attempted regicide. You will be held in the dungeons until the Alpha pronounces your sentence." He smiled, a cruel, triumphant slash across his face. "And I know what that sentence will be." As they dragged her away, her mind was not on her own fate. It was on Draven, poisoned, hurting, alone in his ice, and it was all her fault. The dungeon was a place beneath life, a damp, frigid darkness that smelled of mildew and despair. Lysandra was chained to the wall, the iron shackles biting into her wrists. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the cold, the dark, and the crushing weight of her failure. She had rejected him to protect him, and in doing so, had left him vulnerable to the very man who sought to destroy him. The irony was a blade twisting in her gut. Her silence, her shield, had become her cage, and now, her tomb. After an eternity, the heavy door groaned open. Guards dragged her from the cell, their grips merciless. They hauled her up winding stairs, from the blackness of the dungeon into the harsh gray light of a bleak morning. They were in the central training yard. The entire Shadowclaw pack was assembled, their faces a sea of grim, unforgiving stone. They formed a circle, and in the center was a crude wooden block, an executioner's block. On a raised platform overlooking the yard sat Alpha Draven. Her heart broke all over again. He was a statue of ice. His skin was unnaturally pale, a faint blue tracery of veins visible at his temples. His crimson eyes were dull, flat, devoid of any light or recognition. The frost thorn had done its work. The man who had confessed his love to her under the moonlight was gone, entombed in a prison of magical frost. All that remained was the empty shell of the Shadow King. Corvain stood beside the throne, a hand resting on his alpha's shoulder in a proprietary, protective gesture that was obscene. His expression was one of solemn, victorious duty. "The witch is brought before you, Alpha," Corvain announced, his voice ringing across the silent yard. "The wolfless stray who poisoned your mind and sought to bring ruin to this pack. She has been found guilty of treason. The law demands only one punishment." Draven did not move. He did not even seem to be breathing. He stared blankly at a point somewhere over Lysandra's head. "Pronounce the sentence, my king," Corvain prompted gently, his voice oozing with false loyalty. "Let us cleanse this pack of her taint." Slowly, as if moving through frozen honey, Draven lifted a hand and pointed a single trembling finger at Lysandra. "Death," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping echo. A collective sigh of approval went through the crowd. This was justice. This was their law. The guards shoved Lysandra forward, forcing her to her knees before the block. The wood was stained dark, rough against her cheek. The executioner, a mountain of a man with a hooded face and an enormous axe, stepped forward. This was the end. She was going to die, and the man she loved had condemned her. His mind too poisoned to know what he was doing. She had failed to protect him. She had failed to save herself. She had failed at everything. But as the executioner raised his axe, a fire ignited within her. Not a gentle warmth, but a raging inferno of love and despair and fury. Number. It would not end like this. He would not be left in the clutches of that monster, a frozen puppet king. Her silence had cost them everything. It was time to break her vow. She took a ragged breath, drawing on every ounce of life left in her. She thought of his gentle touch, of the vulnerability in his eyes, of the home she had glimpsed in his soul, and she screamed his name. "Draven!" It was not a plea. It was a roar. A sound born of a human throat but forged in the heart of a soulmate's devotion. It ripped through the silence of the yard, raw, pure, and powerful. It was the sound of a heart breaking and fighting back all at once. It was not a wolf's howl, but it held all the power of a true Luna calling to her alpha. The sound, so pure and untainted by shift or growl, carried a magic all its own. It struck Draven like a physical blow. He convulsed on his throne, a strangled cry tearing from his lips. He clutched his chest, his eyes, his real eyes, flaring to life behind the icy facade. The crimson flames were back, burning with agony and confusion. The poison's hold was shattering. "What is this?" Corvain snarled, his plan crumbling before his eyes. "Kill her!" Now. The executioner, startled, swung the axe, but Draven moved like lightning. He launched himself from the throne, a blur of black leather and fury, and smashed into the executioner, sending the man flying. The axe clattered harmlessly to the ground. "You!" Draven gasped, staggering as he fought the remnants of the poison. He pointed a trembling hand at Corvain. "It was you." The pieces were slamming together in his newly freed mind. The rejection, the poison, the frame-up. Corvain's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. His gamble had failed. "You are weak!" he screamed, drawing a wicked-looking dagger from his belt, its blade coated in a sickly green paste. "I will save this pack from you!" He lunged, not at the other warriors, but at Draven, who was still fighting to gain his footing. Lysandra didn't think. She acted. She scrambled from the block and threw herself in front of her mate. The blade intended for Draven's heart sliced across her arm instead. Pain, white-hot and searing, exploded through her, but she didn't cry out. Her eyes were locked on Draven's. The moment her blood was shed for him, the moment her body shielded his, something broke. The final vestiges of his curse, the ancient ice in his veins, shattered into a billion pieces. A wave of raw, untamed power exploded from him, a tangible aura of heat and life and pure alpha dominance. It washed over the entire yard, forcing every warrior to their knees. He was healed. He was whole. He was more powerful than ever before. He let out a roar of his own, a true alpha's roar that shook the very foundations of the spire. He turned on Corvain, his eyes blazing with the fire of 1,000 suns. The fight was not a fight. It was an execution. Draven moved with a grace and brutality that was terrifying to behold, disarming and disabling his former beta in seconds. But he did not kill him. He left him broken and whimpering on the ground for his guards to seize. Then he rushed to Lysandra. She was swaying on her feet, the green poison from the dagger already making her vision swim. He swept her into his arms, his face a mask of terror and adoration. "Lysandra," he breathed, his voice thick with unshed tears. "You saved me." "I love you," she whispered, the words feeling wondrous and new on her tongue. "And I you," he choked out. "Forgive me." He looked at her bleeding arm, then at the stunned faces of his pack. He knew what he had to do. He lowered his head to the crook of her neck. This was the claiming, the bite that would mark her as his Luna. But it was not an act of dominance. It was an act of reverence. He pressed his teeth against her skin gently, a seal of devotion, not a brand of ownership. A pulse of his own life force, his pure, newly freed alpha magic flowed from him into her. She felt a wave of warmth spread from the mark, neutralizing the poison, healing the cut on her arm, and filling her with a strength she had never known. He lifted his head, a single tear tracing a path down his scarred cheek. He faced his pack, holding her close against him, her head tucked under his chin. "Behold," his voice boomed, filled with a love and power they had never heard before. "Lysandra, of the Shadowclaw, my mate, my heart, your Luna Queen." 1 year later, the onyx spire was transformed. Sunlight, once a stranger to its halls, now streamed through newly installed windows, illuminating tapestries that depicted not scenes of war, but of a great black wolf and a silent, silver-eyed woman standing together under the moon. The air no longer smelled of old blood and cold stone, but of baking bread, fresh herbs from Lysandra's gardens, and the quiet contentment of a pack that was finally whole. The great hall was filled to bursting, not with warriors braced for judgment, but with families celebrating the first anniversary of their Luna's ascension. The Shadowclaw pack was still strong, still fierce, but their strength was no longer brittle. Lysandra's influence, her quiet compassion and unwavering belief in justice over blind brutality had tempered their fire. Draven, freed from his curse, ruled with a wisdom and warmth that had earned him not just fear, but a fierce, unshakable love from his people. Lysandra stood on the dais beside him, her hand in his. She was no longer the silent, invisible girl. She wore a simple gown of deep blue that complemented her station without being ostentatious. Her voice, once her greatest shame, was now one of her greatest assets. She spoke with a quiet authority, her counsel sought by warriors and servants alike. She had taught them that true strength was not the absence of weakness, but the courage to embrace it. Draven leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Are you happy, my love?" he whispered, his voice for her alone. She turned to him, a radiant smile on her face. She looked into his crimson eyes, which now only ever held the warm, steady flame of his love for her. "I have never known the meaning of the word until now," she answered, her voice clear and strong. He placed a hand gently on her stomach, where a slight, hopeful curve was beginning to show beneath the fabric of her gown. A miracle. A child, conceived from a love so powerful it had defied curses and rewritten destinies. A true-born heir for the Shadowclaw, born not of a shifter, but of a wolfless Omega who had proven to have the strongest spirit of them all. The pack had been stunned by the news, then overcome with joyous celebration. It was the final, undeniable proof that their Luna was a blessing from the moon goddess herself. Draven looked out over his thriving pack, his healed kingdom, and his beloved, radiant mate carrying their future. He had been the Shadow King, a ruler of ice and fear. But she, his silent stray, his hidden gem, had walked out of the darkness and taught him how to feel the sun. She was his Luna. She was his salvation. She was his home. And together, their reign was not one of shadow, but of a brilliant, enduring light.